Thank you so much, Joanne. Good morning.
Good morning.
See if I can figure out how these slides work. Right. So, like Joanne said, 10 years ago, I found myself back at school. I'd had a brief 5-year career in the law, and I had decided that it was now time, finally, to go back out into the world to become a superhero. So I went to the place that all superheroes are born, the Kennedy School. And of course, I didn't end up becoming a superhero. What actually happened is I ended up at McKinsey, which is still pretty good. And through my work at McKinsey, I've been able to work with all sorts of clients in lots of different places around the world. I've been able to help clients work on problems as micro as interpersonal dynamics and trying to figure out ways to make their teams function more effectively, to problems as macro as coming up with a new national strategy. But in all that work that I've done during my time at McKinsey, I would say that the one course that I took at the Kennedy School that I've found to be the most useful and the one that I've lent on the most, and I'm sure my other professors wouldn't mind me saying this, was a little course that I did called Exercising Leadership, the Politics of Change. It's the one course that took more mind space and more heart space than any other course, but it fundamentally changed the way that I think about the process of change and how it is that I think about leadership. So in my time that I've worked with clients, I've literally used the ideas from this course every single day. In every coaching conversation that I've had, in every client engagement that I've had. I've used my technical skills to help them come up with big, beautiful, bold, ambitious visions of what it is that they want to achieve. But it's been adaptive leadership and the diagnostic side of things that's really helped us to think about what does it mean to actually deliver on this work? How do we actually bridge the gap and build the capacity of the people that I'm working with, but also their people, to be able to deliver on that vision? So if the strategy is a New Year's resolution, I want to lose 100 pounds, then adaptive leadership has been the magnifying glass that we've brought to their challenges to help them think about, okay, but what is it about our organization that's really amazing, that's really beautiful, on top of which we want to build and do more, and where are the gaps? Where are those maladaptive practices? What's our cultural DNA? What's our organizational context, our historical context? And what does that mean for how quickly or how effectively we can implement change? So what I'd like to do for us today is to basically go through some of these ideas. But in taking you through some of these ideas in the next hour, I'd really like for us to start by creating the canvas against which we will work. So just as a start, I'd like you to each take a few minutes and to think about some challenge context that you're currently operating in. Or if you're working with a client, then it could be something that your client is currently dealing with. But some change context where you're trying to work with a group of people and you have an aspiration for them, something that you'd like to achieve. And I'd like for you to think about the gap that exists between that aspiration and the current reality. So it could be a team that's not working as effectively as they should be or communicating as effectively as they should be, or an organization or a community or group of people that you want to take somewhere and they're having a struggle getting there. So if you just take a few minutes to just think about that and to write it down. Okay, great. So, exercising leadership, the politics of change. So there's two main ideas that I'd like for us to walk through this morning. And the first part of what I'd like us to talk about is the navigating the politics of change piece. Now, a lot of people go into change contexts, into transformations, into trying to move a group of people with a fabulous plan for what it is that they want to do. It's written down on a piece of paper, and it has dates and specific actions that people are going to take that will be done by a particular point in time. We spend a lot of time doing the analysis that gets us to that point of planning, but we don't hardly ever spend enough time thinking about the human side of the equation. The very real, but also very complex, human and systemic dynamics of what makes change hard. So the first part of this morning, I'd like for us to spend some time thinking about what makes change hard. What are the barriers to change? And what does it mean to try to hold people through that process? The second big idea that I want us to talk about is the exercising leadership part. What does leadership mean? Right now, if you go on the website and you look up the Harvard catalog and you put in the word leadership, there's probably 500 different courses, all with a very different definition of what leadership means. But what is leadership? And how does it differ from authority? And when is each of those important or relevant? And what does that mean in the context of change? What does leadership look like when the situation that you're dealing with is something that you haven't quite ever seen before? And it's not enough for us to just look to the top and wait for direction to come from the heavens. And what we need to do is to develop some kind of a much more distributed, sustainable, robust model of leadership. So those are big things that I want us to look at today. What is the navigating politics piece? And what does exercising leadership look like in that context? So in the almost cumulatively 50 years that we've been thinking about these ideas, Ron Heifetz, Marty Linsky, Xander Grashow, that number has leaned more towards them because they're all really old. The biggest mistake that we have seen and the biggest waste of time and resources that we've seen in organizations who are trying to lead people through change is a diagnostic failure. People get the definition of the problem wrong. And because they get the definition of the problem wrong, they also get the solution wrong. And they get the definition of the problem wrong because they tend to treat a whole world of problems that might otherwise be called adaptive as if they were technical. So they treat problems that are adaptive, that require learning and that require engaging people as if they were technical and prone to expertise. But what I'd like to put to you is that being able to take that step back and to start off by understanding what the difference is between those challenges will save you an awful lot of time. It'll allow you to plan more effectively, to put the right number of people to an engagement that you're trying to do. But more importantly than that, particularly in the world of adaptive challenges, it'll allow you the freedom to be able to allow for questioning, for experimentation, for innovation, which is a much more effective compass when you're dealing with navigating the politics of human systems. So what then is a technical problem, and what is an adaptive challenge? So a technical problem is something that has a known origin. It's something that you can understand. You can see what the problem is. A child comes to the hospital and they have a broken arm. The doctor fixes it. A house is on fire. You pick up the phone and you call 911, and the fire brigade turns up with a big red truck and they put the fire out. Your phone breaks. You can take it somewhere, and somebody will fix it for you. These problems have known solutions, and you can outsource the problem to an expert who will fix it for you. Just before we started this morning, you all had breakfast out there. That used to be an adaptive challenge. Many an ancestor felt ill after having eaten a poisonous mushroom or a poisoned berry. But you didn't even have to think about it. The food was ready when you were. It was at the appropriate temperature, hot or cold. You even had choices. There's a whole infrastructure, a whole system of people outside of this room who made sure that that berry could be on your plate this morning looking bright and juicy and red. Waiters, chefs, growers, farmers. There's a whole network of people outside of this room who technically made sure that that was possible for you. Okay, so what then is an adaptive challenge, and how does that differ from a technical problem? Well, an adaptive challenge tends to consist of a gap between a current reality and an aspiration, which is where we just started. And bridging that gap is not possible with technical expertise. It tends to be the type of problem where you've tried 6, 7 different things and you've thrown so many different experts at it, and the thing just won't go away. And usually the reason it won't go away is because the work that needs to be done to bridge that gap actually lives within people. It lives within people's values, within their hearts and their minds, their beliefs, their habits, their ways of being, within organizational DNA. And bridging that gap is not something that can be outsourced. It requires you to involve the people with the problem in terms of trying to find the resolution, because in them lives the problem, but quite frankly also lives the solution. So if in trying to bridge the gap between the current and the aspired reality, the solution within a technical problem looks like a straight line, because you need to build a bridge from point A to point B. You have experts. You know how many men and women you're going to need, how many tons of steel. And if that's a straight line, you know that it's going to be completed by X date. An adaptive challenge, on the other hand, because it lives in people, has multiple faces. And trying to predict people is like trying to predict the weather. So that line looks much more like a zigzag, and it just takes more time. So if in the first scenario, you're using time and money to get from point A to point B, what you really need when you're working with adaptive challenges is to work in the hearts and the minds of people, to look at their loyalties and their really deeply held beliefs. But all of this is really academic. So what I'd like to do is to take you through an illustration of this. And in going through it, I'd like to give you my own example, but as we do that, I'd like for you to think about the challenge that you've nominated and to apply as many of these ideas to that as possible. So as Joanne said, I come from Zimbabwe. My family comes from this really small village that's in the south center of Zimbabwe. It's a little place called Njanja. And in this village lives my uncle, who is my favorite person in the world. Zimbabwe fought a war of independence against the British. And in 1980, we gained our independence. And all the women and men who came home from the war were heroes, the comrades. My uncle is one of those men. And I grew up on a steady diet of stories about the war and all the victories they'd had and the narrow escapes. He is an action figure in our village. As you can see, our village is at the base of a mountain. At the top of the mountain are the schools and the buses and the hustle and bustle, and most of the homesteads are at the valley. And when people walk down from the mountain, they walk right past our house. Ours is the first house as you descend the mountain. And of course, people stop and they have conversations. And of course, because my uncle is the man that he is, everybody stops by and they sit down under the tree next to the kitchen hut, and they eat and they drink and they smoke. And of course, because my uncle is the man that he is, every evening of an evening, as the dew starts to settle in and you hear the crickets and the stars start to twinkle in the sky, as he's sitting under the tree with his friends, the women bring out the food. The staple food in Zimbabwe is something that's called sadza, and it's a really thick porridge that you eat with your hands. It's made out of maize meal. But because they're men, of course, they eat man-sized portions of sadza, along with man-sized portions of meat and little lady-sized portions of vegetables. And that was all fine for a really long time. Until a few years ago, we're in Harare, in the capital city, and my cousin's about to have a baby. It's my uncle's first grandchild, and one of the first in our family. So we're there, and we're all in a celebratory mood, and we're sitting around the dinner table. But at some point, my uncle starts to have a really hard time breathing. And everybody's really worried, so we all get together, and we put him in the car, and we drive him to the local hospital. And when we get there, the doctor sits him down and takes a look. And within a very short amount of time, they've diagnosed what's wrong with him. And they say to him, look, you are a prime candidate for heart disease. If you want to live to see this grandchild be born and grow up, there's 3 very simple things that you need to do. You need to eat less, you need to move more, and you need to stop drinking and smoking. And you would think that for somebody who has so much to live for, who is about to welcome their first grandchild into the world, you would think that that would be enough to get them to change. But of course, my uncle does what 99% of other heart patients do. And within a very short time, he's back in the hospital. But this time, it's on the operating table. And quite honestly, I find it amazing, the miracle of modern medicine, that you can take a man and put him on a table. You can cut his chest open through the bone. And then you can play with his heart. You have machines that pump blood for him and keep him alive. Anesthesiologists, I never know how to say this word, who can pump enough pain medicine into his body to make sure that they numb the pain, but not so much that they kill him. And when they're done, it's amazing that they can stitch him up and put him back together again. Sew him up with wire, like a rag doll. Send him home with some medication, and before long, relatively in the time of the world, he's back on his feet and he's functioning really effectively. There is an entire system, an entire technical system out there that has been developed and worked out by us, by human beings, to deal with these very problems. Gurneys, lights, hospital systems that are there to make sure that we stay alive. It's technical. The problem is known. He has a heart problem. The solution is known. He needs surgery. The expertise is out there. Hand him over to the doctors and then give him back to us. And all he needs is a certain amount of time and money to heal, and things will be fine. But of course, that's only part of the problem. Because it's not a year later that I'm back in the village and I'm standing in the kitchen with the other women. Because it doesn't matter that I teach at Harvard or I have a fancy job at McKinsey or that I live in Boston. When I'm in the village, I'm a woman and I play my role. I'm someone's daughter, I'm someone's wife, and I'm standing in the kitchen with the other women cooking man-sized portions of meat and vegetables. And I look over to where the men are sitting under the tree. And what do I see? There's my uncle. He's holding the fort as usual. And in his hand is a beer. And his other hand is a cigarette. I look to my uncle and my auntie and I say, what's going on? Didn't we almost lose him? And as she starts to explain things to me, and I look at him and the light flickers across his face and he tells that story again about how they escaped from the Rhodesian army by hiding behind the cattle kraal, I realize the other part of the problem is wedged deeply inside of him. And working the technical side is just never going to be enough. Now, it may have crossed your mind, and it may occur to you that change is hard. And you may say to me, well, this is just one of those situations. You need to let it go. Change is difficult. And we could do that with our organizations and the work that we're trying to do, but the truth is that I just don't think that that's actually true, because change is not hard. Every day, people make decisions, and they make choices, like getting married, or having children, or moving into a bigger house, or buying a different car, or cashing in the winning lottery ticket. I mean, how many people here would turn down the winning lottery ticket? I don't want the $5 million. I'm quite happy living the life I was living. Thank you very much. No, there's all sorts of changes that we make when we think that the change is good for us. It's only when people think that change is bad that they push back on it and that they resist loss. But at the same time, as we think about change in organizations, as we think about adaptation, as we think about what it takes to bridge that gap, one truth is that change is inevitable. Because even in nature, on which we're leaning quite heavily this morning, adaptation requires some shift in the DNA sequence. Because for a caterpillar to turn into a butterfly, that DNA sequence cannot stay the same. There's some pieces of it that will need to shift, some that will need to be deleted, some that will need to be rearranged. So to try to go through a change process without paying attention to that or recognizing that that's a real part of it is really only looking at part of the picture and solving part of the problem. But it's important. It's important to pay attention to that loss. Because in human systems, that loss looks like the loss of a job, the loss of reputation, identity, a sense of belonging. And you need to be able to trace the pathology of that loss, because that's the clue to where the work is. And in the case of my uncle, who is he if he can't eat a man-sized portion of sadza? What does it even mean to be an African man? What happens if he sits under that tree and serves salad? Will his friends still come? Will he still have any kind of relevance in the system? But also, what does it mean for him to accept that he might be dying? These are all very real losses. But unless you can understand what it is that people are protecting, the chances are that as you go into organizations, as you work with people, as you try and get people to change, you won't be able to get anywhere because you're not meeting them where they are, in the struggles that they're having, looking at the things that they care about. And the likelihood is that as you try to implement these changes, you'll be capped at the knees and you won't even know why or how. I mean, how often have you gone into an organizational context and you have this whiz-bang idea of some process that you want to change? And it could be something as simple as implementing a new process or a new computer system. And you spend 3 months trying to get this thing done. You bring in all the best experts as you get frustrated that things not working. And at some point, you start to bang your head against the wall and you throw your hands in the air and you say, I was going to swear, I won't. The system is broken. This thing is just not working. These people just don't get it, and we blame the system. Well, I have news for you. The news is that there's no such thing as a broken system. The system is designed to get exactly the results that it's currently getting. Your job is to try to figure out why the system is reacting in the way that it is. So, like I said, I grew up in this village, and in the evenings, you can hear the crickets. But I spent quite some time living and working in Nigeria, and in the evening what you hear there is generators and the whir of the generators as they come on and off. And so many people are frustrated with that system, and they wonder, why can't the government fix the electricity system? Why can't they build out the electricity? I mean, this country generates millions, billions of dollars in oil. But then if you really trace it and you look at that system and you try to understand who are the people who own the generator companies, you realize that to do that would generate so many different losses in that system. And so unless you can understand that network of relationships and that network of where all the losses are, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to make much change. But in the same way that people protect against losses, people also protect against the things that they value. So what do people care about? Who are they loyal to? What relationships do they need to go back home to talk about when things have changed? And that's why the diagnostic piece is just so important. And why does it matter? I mean, because if you're able to understand what you're asking people to go through, if you're able to understand the extent of the pain that you're trying to get them to feel, then you can anticipate those losses. And to the extent possible, you might be able to cushion them. You might be able to pace that work so that it's not all too sudden and too difficult. But at the same time, if you can't make those trade-offs, because a lot of the time when I hear people talk about win-win situations and they're working really difficult adaptive challenges, I know that they're probably not working anything that is of relevance. Because the truth is, there will be losses and there will be casualties. So how do you face into those and plan for them and hold people through that change rather than pretend that they don't exist? At the same time, even in nature, change is incremental. The percentage difference between us and a human being and a chimpanzee is a simple 1%. But that 1% makes the difference between us being able to sit in this room, in this heated environment, or us being out in the snow. And so too, when we go into organizations and we're trying to get things done, we tend to spend a lot of time talking about what's going to change. We spend a lot of time talking about what there is to lose. But for change to be really sustainable, what you actually want to try to do is to build into what already works, because a lot will actually stay the same. Heifetz likes to say, God didn't do zero-based budgeting. And if I think about my youth growing up, I remember the number of NGOs that would come and they would have another solution that they tried in Indonesia or something else that they tried in Brazil. And they would say, well, this is probably going to work in Zimbabwe. And they would give it to us and put it on us and we would try it. And part of the time it wouldn't work because it didn't fit within our cultural context or our DNA. like the time that they created this project that took all of the collections from the pit latrine toilets, and they used it to fertilize the vegetables in the gardens. People went hungry for a really long time. So as you think about the solutions that you're designing and the work that you're doing with organizations, how much time are you thinking about what actually fits within this cultural context? So that's what makes change hard. The fact that it involves loss, and that people push back on that loss. And you need to take the time to really understand what you're asking people to go through. So I'd like for us to move on to talking about how you actually mobilize people to do this work, the exercising leadership part. But before I do that, I would like for us to play a little game. So just very quickly, I'm going to put a picture on the screen, and I'd just love to hear what it is that you see. Just yell it out. What do you see?
Starfish.
A starfish? A wave? The top of a dinosaur. I love that. Okay. Now what do you see? Now what do you see? Austria. And now what do you see? A puzzle. Okay, so let's take this and apply it to the case of my uncle. So quite often you're called into problem context and somebody sits down and they say to you, this is the challenge that I'm dealing with, or this is the person that I can't get along with, or this is the uncle who has a heart problem. And very quickly, you're pulled into that frame. And suddenly, you're working that problem because that's what the person has come to you with. But if you take a minute to zoom out, what you might realize is that the uncle is only the rooster's crown, the wave, the dinosaur hills. Because that uncle lives within a community of friends with whom he spends a lot of time. And those are the first places that he goes to make decisions. He lives within a family of people who care about him and who shape and push and drive how it is that he moves through the world and the decisions that he makes. He lives within a culture and a traditional context that in this case was pushing very hard against the Western medicine with medical providers and media and so on and so on and so on. But effectively, this exercise of zooming out, or as we say in adaptive leadership, getting on the balcony, is critically important as you go through these change contexts and try to get people to do work. Because unless you can zoom out and see more, it's likely that you're only working a small part of the problem. So if in this conversation that we're having and the head of finance is refusing to sign off on another truck, we could get into this, and it could become about me and you, and the fact that you now don't like me, and why are you being so difficult? Or I could think, what else are you holding right now? What else is in that universe behind you? Because you are a finance manager within an organization that reports to a board, that has a corporate strategy, that reports to shareholders, that's in a regulatory and political environment. So even in this conversation that we're having, how much of that weighs in? And how often, as you're holding clients through change, are you being able to zoom out and zoom back in this way? And it's not that you want to solve the entire world, but you need to figure out where in that dynamic are the things that you are currently dealing with being weighed down on. But even then, working with my uncle may require me also to work with his friends, because they all hold a piece of the mess. And therein also lies a solution. And even in finding that solution, it may benefit me to harness that entire system. But working through these levels of abstraction and recognizing that sometimes problems exist like little Russian dolls, like a problem inside another problem, it's important to do that work, because otherwise you're only working one part of the problem. I mean, even when you go to the doctor, they sit you down and they zoom out historically. You know, what happened in your family? Does anybody else have this disease? You know, how long have you been feeling this way? But it's really seductive to work only that piece of the problem that you can get your hands around. So, What does this mean for you? Diagnosis is key. Take the time to distinguish between technical challenges and adaptive challenges. And do that because it's important also to understand the cultural and the historical context, even when you're coming up with technical things that need to be done. Because you've shown me this valley, and it's beautiful. But then there's this 10,000-foot mountain that's in the way, and I don't know how to get across that. So what does it look like to do the work of saying, okay, so here's Mark, and here's his team of these 5 reports. Given this organization's organizational DNA and the dynamics that exist in this space, what does that mean in terms of how fast and how quickly we can pace change? Is it a 1-degree departure from the current reality? Is it 5 degrees? Is it 10 degrees? Over what time frame? In what sequence? Using which allies? There's so much richness in that diagnosis, but only working one piece of the puzzle is only a job half done. The second thing is focus on the people, because the people with the problem are the problem, but they're also the solution. But working with people is messy. It takes time. Allow that time and just recognize that otherwise you're going to be back working this problem again and again and again, unless you can work that piece of it as well. Third is to remember that people don't resist change. They resist loss. Anticipate and understand what it is that you're asking people to go through. Have compassion for that. And then also remember that there's no such thing as a broken system. The system is designed to get exactly the results it's currently getting. You just need to figure out why. So I've just put up here a few reflecting questions. I don't think we'll have time to pause and look at them, but I'd like for you to think about them in relation to your challenge. Okay. So let's talk about the exercising leadership part. So like technical and adaptive, the other 2 big distinctions that we like to make in adaptive leadership are this distinction between leadership and authority. A lot of the time, people get these things confused, and they treat them like they're the same thing. You tend to conflate them. But just like with technical and adaptive, I think it's enormously helpful to be able to pass out these definitions and to be able to understand what each of them brings as a resource that you can leverage in the process of leading people through change. And in order to understand leadership, it's actually really helpful to, first of all, put that aside and to, first of all, focus on the authority part of the equation. So authority is essentially a solution to a problem. There was a time on Earth where creatures lived solo. A little turtle would hatch from a shell in the sand, and it would crawl out on its spindly little legs. And as it came into the world, it would crawl around and learn how to hunt, how to find food, how to look after itself. And that was fine until there came the time for it to mate. And then it would meet another little turtle, and they would mate and lay some eggs in the sand. And then an egg would hatch. And on its spindly little legs, it would climb out of the sand and wander around. And the world was great. But at some point, animals started to live in social systems, and it became necessary for them to live in groups. And this created a problem of how do we organize ourselves? How do we figure out who gets to call the directions and call the shots? And essentially, this created what some people will be allergic to this term, what we call basically dominance hierarchies, which you see everywhere. They're ubiquitous within our social systems and also in nature, where we appoint people and we give them the roles of setting the directions. You're the CEO, come up with a strategy. You're the teacher, tell me what to do. Mum and dad, you're basically the authority figure. And with each of those authority relationships, basically comes a set of responsibilities that you have. If you think about your job description, that's essentially the authorization that you have within the role that you're in. The roles or the activities that authority figure is expected to deliver on can essentially be pointed and boiled down to providing direction, protection, and order. And another great illustration of this that comes from nature is if we think again about our cousins, the chimpanzees. Whenever they wake up in the morning, they rear up their heads, and the first thing that they do is they look in the direction of the alpha. It could be an alpha male, or it could be an alpha female. And the alpha sets the direction. The alpha says, we're going to go this way today. This is where we shall drink. This is where we shall eat, and this is where we shall sleep. This is the order in which we'll sleep. The women and the children will be in the middle, and then the men, and then on the outside, the younger men in case there's an attack. And as long as the alpha is able to provide these services, the alpha can keep their role. But the day that they take you to the third watering hole and there's no water, or the day that the alpha is unable to break up a fight between two young bucks, you better know that the alpha will be deauthorized. Quite often we go into these authority relationships and you start to think, I'm the boss, everything's great, I'm going to be fine. But what you don't realize is that authority is actually a contract for services. It's a relationship where party A, the authorizer, gives to party B, the person in authority, power. And I entrust you, I give you that power, but in exchange, I expect for you to provide to me certain services, which are essentially these services of direction, protection, and order. Now for me, this picture creates a little bit of a dilemma. Because if you really think about this, particularly juxtaposed against what we just talked about in terms of adaptive type challenges, it creates a little bit of a problem. Because what then happens if the situation requires the person in authority actually to put some of the work back on you? If the doctor can't do the exercise for you, if the doctor can't go on the diet for you, if the president can't find the jobs for you, and you need to take on some of that work, you need to learn the new skill, it becomes really complicated because it's an upset to the authority relationship. Because now suddenly things have changed, because the problem context has changed. So now might be a good time to talk about leadership. What then is leadership? Well, leadership is an activity, the way that we think about it. It's something that you do. And it's an activity that is available to anyone at any point in time, 24 hours a day, where any one of us can step up and exercise leadership. I mean, you can do it from a position of authority, but that can be difficult for the reasons I've just said, and sometimes it's actually a lot easier to exercise leadership without it. In history, you see all kinds of people who've exercised leadership from all kinds of different places. In the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who passed the 13th Amendment to end slavery in this country, did that from a position of authority, but he upset a lot of apple carts along the way. At the same time, on the other side of the world, years later, Nelson Mandela, without any authority, brokered the deal that ended apartheid in South Africa, without being called into the game, without a fancy title, without being president of, as they say in America, the world. And this week, Greta Thunberg appears on the front page of the Times magazine as one of the most influential people in the world. Again, exercising leadership, galvanizing people, pulling them together, mobilizing work on issues that really matter. That's how we define leadership. And as you think about navigating change, as you think about the challenge that you're currently working, there's three main activities to leadership. The first big activity is to get on the balcony. We're back in the diagnostic space. The first activity is to diagnose. This is a critical task of leadership. How are you able to get on the balcony to be able to understand what's happening within the system and where the system needs to go? Now, this sounds deceptively simple, but it's not. In Buddhism, they call it contemplation and action. Sorry, the Jesuits call it contemplation and action. The Buddhists call it karmic yoga. The Hindus call it mindfulness. And if it was as simple as learning or remembering to brush your teeth or to breathe 60 times a minute, we wouldn't have ancient traditions that are dedicated to this art of getting on the balcony. How can you be in the system and on the balcony at the same time? In sports, it's only the most incredible players who are able to dribble the ball down the court with speed and precision. And then Jordan passes the ball to Pippen, and you wonder, how did he even see that he was there? And instead, in our organizations, we get so dragged onto the dance floor We're so focused on the interactions that we're having and on making sure that we come out on top of the other, or people are dragging us there, trying to get us to make decisions. We're caught up in this busyness, and it's really hard to get up and see the wider system. So the first critical task in leadership is get on the balcony, do the analysis, try to understand what parts of this challenge are technical and which pieces are adaptive. What does that mean in terms of how I work the people? Which people do I need to bring into this equation? How do I zoom out and see the bigger picture? Who needs to learn what? That's the first critical task. Second is orchestrating conflict and keeping attention disciplined. As human beings, we have a tendency, it's almost a reflex, to want to avoid pain. It's a really natural part of being human. And you know what this feels like when you get home in the evenings and you've had a really long day and you pour yourself a glass of wine and you turn on the telly and the news is on. And on television is the coverage of the latest natural disaster. Or perhaps it's a story about the latest political scandal. So of course, you change the channel. And the water is rising around us. We're on the ship. And the waves are murky. And this feels really, really dangerous. But our guests want to stay in their cabins, covered in their furs and their jewels. And we don't want to disturb them. We want to keep our old traditions, our old practices that have worked for us for generations and generations and generations before us. We want to keep our fat paychecks and our status. We want to feel confident and to keep our sense of identity. And so what do? We rearrange the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. It's another board paper that's framed just the right way so that this current dip in profits looks like it's a glitch, which is what IBM did in the 90s, as they carried on with this strategy that they'd prepared earlier, rather than dealing with the advent of the internet. Or it's another community meeting where we put aside and ignore this conversation about what do we do about these refugees that are washing up on our shores. Until, like Belgium did, Molenbeek is a no-go zone. And even the police, whose job it is to keep the peace, can't get in to find the terrorists. Or perhaps it's us sitting together at Christmas dinner, having a conversation, but ignoring the fact that the thing that we're really not talking about is what's happening with Dad. Or do we help people to face into that reality? Because these opportunities for leadership are around us every day. But so often we squander them because we want to stay comfortable and we want to keep the relationship and we want things to be just fine. So what does it look like to actually step into that space without waiting to be called, without being tapped on the shoulder, without the position, without the title, and to exercise leadership? And what does that look like for us to build that in our communities and in our families and in our homes? So that's the second task, orchestrate conflict and keep attention disciplined. The third is to regulate the stress. Now, doing this work, holding people and challenging them through loss can be incredibly stressful work. It's not easy. And the graphic that I think illustrates this really well is this one. So if I was to graph along the vertical axis disequilibrium, which is the amount of heat, system, conflict, disquiet that happens in a system as it's going through change. And if I was to graph on the horizontal axis time, you can think about this almost like a pot sitting on a stove or on the fire. At first, as you put in your vegetables and you're making your vegetable soup, nothing happens because there's no heat in the system. And all you have is a bunch of carrots and vegetables and potatoes. So what do? You turn on the heat. And as the temperature rises, things start to cook. At a certain point, you hit what we might call the threshold of learning, where the vegetables start to mix with each other and the flavors start to seep into each other. But you can only do that for so long before you hit what we might call the limit of tolerance, where there's too much heat in the system, where your vegetables start to turn mushy, or things start to burn, or the conflict gets too much and people start to fight or civil war breaks out. So what you're trying to do is to keep things hot enough so that learning is happening, so that conversations are happening, but not so high that you go above the limit of tolerance. And what does this mean then for leadership? If a technical challenge is one that causes a big spike in the system, a broken arm, it's painful, you go to the doctor, they give you medication, it comes down, if that's what the footprint of a technical challenge looks like, then an adaptive challenge looks more like this. It initially sits somewhere in the bottom. Nobody quite wants to talk about it. It's that conversation around the dinner table that's happening but not quite happening. Eventually, somebody exercises this moment of leadership. Perhaps it's a well-placed question or a comment or an observation, and now we're in the learning zone. The work of leadership, then, is how do we keep people in that space? And that squiggly orange line isn't quite accurate because sometimes it goes above and sometimes it comes below. But how do you keep people in that productive space, working the issue, engaging with the tough questions, making the trade-offs for long enough that you can actually make progress on this challenge? That is the work of leadership. How do you assess the ripeness of an issue, the relevance of it? How do you put it on the table in a way that people can stay with it and continue to engage with it? And it's not easy work. So in my situation, it's the fourth time that I've now put this question on the table about what are we going to do about Sekuru because he's going to die, and nobody has listened to me. And I realize that this thing is just sitting in a cold pot. So I look at my own cultural context, because I'm a woman. I work through my uncle's best friend, who then speaks to the chief, who then speaks to the village. Because the truth is, my uncle is not the only one who's sitting under that tree, eating and drinking and smoking and eating these man-sized portions of sadza. All of his friends are too. So what does it look to create that generalized sense of urgency so that other people are also paying attention? What does it look like to give him a sense of purpose about what's possible in the universe, to help him absorb that loss in exchange for something else that he cares about? So now he has all of these holidays that he spends with his grandson. But the question is, what does that look like for you? And even as you put these interventions into the system to try to raise them into this productive zone, trying to predict human beings is like trying to predict the weather. So how are you monitoring that and continuously diagnosing and stepping up onto the balcony to see and understand where the system is? Because people will want to work a void. They will want to bring the temperature down. And your work is to try to keep the issue on the table so that it stays within that productive zone. So, some key takeaways. Authority is power and trusted in exchange for services. Leadership is an activity. Create spaces for people to be able to step into that space and to exercise leadership. Sometimes it's actually easier to do from a place of no authority. Get on the balcony, orchestrate conflict, regulate stress. But in closing, this graph, for somebody who's trying to exercise leadership, also represents what it is that you need to be able to contain. Because as the head of an organization or somebody who's in a coaching relationship with somebody else and you're trying to hold them through a process and you're trying to push them to tackle difficult questions, you need to be able to hold them. And the size of this container and the effectiveness of the work that you can do is completely correlated to your own ability to be able to hold that tension. So where are you on this, and how do you increase your bandwidth? How do you give yourself breaks if you need them? How do you survive this process of holding people through change? Well, one thing that you can think about is to stay diagnostic. Get on the balcony. Do I sound like a broken record now? And try to understand what's happening with the system. Because quite often, it actually isn't even personal. And it's not about you. But you need to understand what it is that you're triggering and touching in people. The second thing is to remember to separate self from role. Because when you're trying to do this work with people, sometimes we get so caught up and so invested in what we're doing that we start to think that that is our self. Or people throw tomatoes or rocks or bricks at us. But what you need to realize is that it's not about you. It's about the role that you're in. As they tackle you on the rugby field, they're not attacking you, they're just trying to get the ball. And at the same time, it works the other way. Because as they kiss your ring, as you wear the crown or the corner office or the fancy title, remember that they're not actually kissing you. They're kissing King. So what does it look like to remember to make that separation? Because if we start to think that the role is us, then that really gets quite murky and it makes it really difficult for you to exercise leadership and for you to be able to see clearly. Also, make sure that you have partners and allies. Because we all have our go-to people. We all have our biases and our ways of thinking. It can be really hard to get onto the balcony unless you're able to see more than you can see. And quite often, it's much easier to do that with other people. Have purpose. Know why you're doing this. Because why would you get out of bed in the morning and upset people? Why would you create an awkward conversation talking about the size of the elephant that's in this room right now? Why would you make that awkward conversation happen unless it was on behalf of something that you really care about? So have a sense of purpose and understand what it is that would make it worth it for you to step into that game. But also think about that for other people. Because quite often when you're trying to lead people through change, you're actually asking them to do really difficult work. So how do you speak to where they hurt? And how do you speak to what they care about, rather than it to be another PR communication or some standard template that we send out whenever we do change work within our organizations? I had a conversation last night with a friend of mine, and I was telling him that I was going to come and do this talk, how nervous I was. And he lives in Singapore. He works for a telecom company out there. And he said, oh, I don't know why you do that stuff. I really hate politics. We went to university together in Australia. And he basically said, look, the more senior I become, the more I hate my job. I just really hate people. And what he meant wasn't that he hated people, but what he was hating was the politics of having to work with all of this every day. That conversation that's not quite that conversation, and the argument about the size of the stationery account that's not really about the stationery account. And I laughed and I said to him, look, buddy, unless you are going to become a hermit and move and live in the forest, or crawl under a rock, or turn into a little turtle that is born on a beach and crawls out on its spindly little legs, you better get used to it, because navigating politics is here to stay. Thank you.